Good morning, Dan and Amy. We need to talk tax plan, but we also need to talk government shutdown theater. We talked about it a little bit, and a lot of people falling for the same extortion tactics of the left on this matter when Republicans are in the minority and they threaten to not go along with the status quo, threaten not to go along with forever expanding Leviathan, then they're the ones that are prompting a shutdown of government. And then when they're in the majority and there's any indication that they may not go along and do the things they said they would do when they ran to climb to the majority, then they're the ones fomenting a government shutdown in that case as well. 18 government shutdowns over the last 4 decades. The longest one lasted about 21 days under Bill Clinton. And yet the left is so good at creating hysteria around it, and Republicans are so bad at standing up to the hysteria and making an argument that pushes back and provides some adult leadership and tonality to these discussions. Social Security, Jessica! And Republicans run for the hills. For more on this, both topics, but let's start with the quote-unquote shutdown theater. We're pleased to be joined by our friend Grover Norquist, of course, president of Americans for Tax Reform. Grover, thanks for being with us again. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Good to be with you.
And so you got to connect tax policy with spend policy. Let's start with the spend policy and your reaction to the capitulation by Republicans on the budget resolution that extends the status quo till September.
Well, it's always annoying because who's ever in charge, the minority party can say, we won't vote to keep the government going. We won't pass a budget or a continuing resolution, and quote-unquote, the government shuts down. Actually, only parts of the government, quote-unquote, shut down, and people who, didn't get paid do get paid later. Yeah. So it's not this end-of-the-world shutdown. The disadvantage Republicans have is that you have the establishment media, ABC, CBS, NBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post. They do exactly what you're saying. When the Republicans say we'll only increase the debt ceiling or pass the continuing resolution if we get X, they are threatening to shut the government down. When, this year, the Democrats said we have to have all these different things or we will not do it. One, the press doesn't say the Democrats are thinking of shutting the government down. They never tell you what the issues are that they're insisting on. So the public is lied to, and this is where you can argue as the establishment press, left wing or whatever, it's lazy and it's dishonest. There are a list of things, vaping, for instance. When vaping, the things that people do when they quit smoking cigarettes and they go to vaping. 10 million people vape. One of the key issues for the Democrats was that they did not want a rider which said that would delay the implementation of a prohibition on vaping. Okay? I don't know if the 10 million Americans who vape heard from the press that one of the key things for them, and the Democrats won on this issue, by the way. They've been fighting this every time this came up. The Democrats have insisted that this is a shutdown issue. The Democrats would rather shut down the government than allow people who vape to legally vape. Obama set up with the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, a prohibition, like prohibition against liquor, prohibition against almost all vaping. And this is a huge issue. It's one of the things that was going to shut the government down. The Republicans, rather than shutting the government down, said, okay, we'll deal with it. Now we can deal with it through the FDA. But it would be nice to do it legislatively.
Well, but also
not told what's going on.
Right, and then you have lines drawn, starting by the Speaker of the House. We're going to defund Planned Parenthood. This is a moral imperative. And the president, we are going to build this wall, even if we have to fund it up front, Mexico pay for it later, whatever about the Mexico thing. The bottom line is funding for the wall is something that he wanted. And other Republicans making their seasonal pitch for defunding the NEA and the NIH and national NEH, and the and public broadcasting and it all goes by the board, and they look like a bunch of simps.
Well, here's the challenge. I'm on the board of the National Rifle Association. We have a series of riders on gun issues that they're important. Every one of those is in, okay? So we want every one of those. The pro-lifers got the pro-life Hyde Amendment, those riders in. So a lot of stuff did happen. That doesn't get discussed. The interesting question of what other issues there were, the press does not accurately or correctly tell you what it is the Democrats were fighting over. So I think we'd be better off if people had a list and you had to drag Nancy Pelosi and say, this you would shut the government down for, and she had to explain what it was. And same thing for the Republicans, because the Republicans also have some non-negotiables. They need to be able to defend and articulate why they want to do X, Y, and Z. But we are ill-served by the press coverage or lack of coverage on what's actually going on.
Okay, so in this funding bill, is there anything in it for Republicans or conservatives?
Well, sure, a whole series of riders. All the riders important to the Second Amendment committee, the riders important to the pro-life committee, those are in, those stay there. Mm-hmm. Again, this is a budget on what could be spent. None of this stuff is appropriated. This does not mean something gets funded. Well, we need to get past this and get to the very serious business of writing appropriations legislation and the tax cut.
Let's talk about the tax cut. Seems like there's two camps, at least in part. One that is really focused on the structural tax relief being revenue neutral, and the other that is less focused on that. And maybe the way to split the difference is to extend out the budget window so that it could overcome, a longer horizon on being revenue neutral, so it can overcome the obstacles posed by reconciliation. Why don't you distill this for us and in which camp you fall?
Sure. The issue is how much, or if any or all, of a tax reduction will be permanent, okay? In order for remember Bush passed a tax cut. It was only good for 10 years. At the end of 10 years, the death tax snapped back to its previous level. All of the tax cuts disappeared, like Cinderella and the pumpkin. That can give you a robust tax cut, good for 10 years, but in year 11, the rules are you can only pass a budget, reconciliation budget, tax and spending changes, if that's permanent, if from year 11 to 50, it does not increase the deficit. That was set up to stop people from creating new spending programs which balloon in the out years. They don't look very big right now, but they balloon in the out years, like many of the government programs got put in by saying, oh, it's just a teeny thing. It's teeny right now. In year 20, it blows into something quite substantial. So that's not a bad rule, but it is the rule we have. And the left is focused on using it to stop tax cuts, not spending increases, but tax cuts. So we can have any tax cut we want if it lasts 10 years. The reason why the Republicans in the House and Senate have been trying to come up with something that was deficit neutral, not tax revenue neutral, deficit neutral in years 11 to 50, is that then it's permanent. Then it stays forever. Now, it's not easy to do that, but they came up with a plan. It's pretty good. I thought it was if the answer was yes or no, I'd say yes, pass it right now, do it, get it done. Other people said, well, the president wants to go not to 20% on the corporate income tax, but to 15. That's good. 15 is a better number than 20. It's lower. Mm-hmm. But it adds about $1 trillion in reduced revenue to the government each decade, and therefore that could only be temporary.
Not deficit
well,
neutral.
Don't you think it'll pay for itself with growth?
Oh, the corporate income tax, I believe, will pay for itself with growth. Here's the challenge. Under the law, okay, not some rule that we can change, but under the law, the Senate parliamentarian, who nobody elected, gets to look at this and say whether this particular change in the law, one, is a Byrd compliant, so the Byrd's law compliant. Is it deficit neutral in years 11 to 50? And they use CBO, Congressional Budget Office numbers, and unfortunately, they are insufficiently focused on dynamic scoring. So you're quite correct. When we cut taxes, when the country cut taxes, and in 2003 to 2007, cut in the tax on capital gains, cut in dividend tax, we raised more money. Federal government raised more money over that 4-year period after the tax cut than they were planning to raise if there'd been no tax cut. So if somebody tells you that tax cuts never pay for themselves, well, the most recent tax cut in American history paid for itself. And the Reagan tax cuts raised more money than had been expected otherwise. It's just that the Democrats they go, oh, but the deficit increased. Yes, because the Democrats kept spending money. But in terms of revenue, in terms of raising revenue, the Reagan tax cuts raised more revenue over the next 20 years than the government would have expected under its previous path.
Now, but to get this done, to get something on approximating what Trump has outlined, one of the arguments that's being made by the likes of Steve Forbes is just like we exercise the so-called nuclear option with Supreme Court nominees, exercise the nuclear option here. He writes in Forbes that nothing Congress passes is permanent, no matter what a law or rule says. Congress can change or amend any bill it's passed anytime it wants. Remember the Historic Tax Reform Act of 86 that slashed the highest income rates from 50 to 28. 4 years later, Congress, at the behest of H.W. Bush, raised the top rate and increased or added other levies for a sizable tax hike. 3 years after that, Bill Clinton upped the top rate again and junked up the code even more. So go to, simple majority and move this thing along as you suggested. What do you say to that?
Well, I think what they're likely to do is do some of the tax cut made permanent and some of it good for 10 years. If you reduce the death tax or abolish the death tax, as the Republicans want to do, as Trump has agreed he wants to do, it doesn't do any good to abolish the death tax for 10 years because everybody who's planning on living longer than 10 years still has to organize their life around the death tax possibly being back. So they buy insurance, they do all these ridiculous things that the government makes you do. So and the business community, if you're asking people to build factories in the United States, not overseas, because we're going to have a territorial tax system where we tax things in the United States but not overseas, factories last longer than 10 years. Decisions made now affect things. So some of these, if you want to affect people's behavior by having lower taxes and a more rational tax system, on some of these issues, it needs to be permanent. They need to know. Look, permanent means only if the Democrats win the House, the Senate, and the presidency, they get to change it. All right. The reason why Bush 41, Herbert Walker Bush, gave in was he had Democratic House and Democratic Senate, and he was focused on other things. So he lost that fight. He also wasn't a Reagan Republican, and if Reagan had been there, he wouldn't have lost the fight. But Bush did. He didn't get what was at stake. So today, however, 90% of Republicans in the House, the Senate, and the White House are Reagan Republicans. So all generally moving in the right direction. So if you have any House Republican, you will stop a tax increase. That didn't used to be true. It is true now. We haven't had since 1990 a tax increase enacted unless the Democrats had the House, the Senate, and the presidency. If the Republicans had the House or the Senate or the presidency, they stopped any tax increase since 1990. That's a pretty good deal.
Yeah, but the prospect now with complete control is we want substantial reductions in structural taxes to unleash growth, which is what Trump has outlined. And the question is, are Republicans, Ryan and McConnell and the caucus is going to get their acts together to do something along those lines?
Well, if the question is, how much of it can you make permanent? What parts of it do you make permanent? What parts do you say, we're going to have dramatic tax cuts, it's going to be good for 10 years, it's going to be so good that the other teams...
Well, but Grover, bottom line this for me. How sanguine are you that substantial tax reform is going to move that incentivizes growth in this country?
Oh, Absolutely, absolutely. We are going to get something that looks very much like the plan the House of Representatives put together or the plan that Trump put together, which are basically the very similar plans. There's 90% agreement between the House and Senate and the president on these plans. I like the president's decision to go to a 15% corporate rate rather than 20%. 15 is better. It's a lower number. I was just in Australia 2 days ago. Takes a long time to fly back from Australia. But I was in Australia, and I met with the leadership of their Treasury Department, and they said, we're at 30%. Our corporate rate in Australia is 30%. If you guys go to 15, we have to go towards 15. This would be a change. This is a tax cut for the world, okay? For the world. If we take the corporate rate to 15, the rest of the world will go towards 15 as well. We will be, helping people in dozens of countries. Ours first, but dozens of countries. This is an amazing shift, and I do believe it will pass. It will pass this year. Will there be people whining, oh, I would like this little thing changed or that little thing? Will there be different industries that go, wait a minute, I don't get everything I always wanted? The answer is yes. You don't get everything you wanted. But it is going to be a monumental pro-growth package that passes.
Okay.
It will pass before the year is over.
All right. On that happy note, he is Grover Norquist, President of Americans for Tax Reform. Grover, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate your insights.
It's going to be huge, huge.
Huge. Thanks, Grover.
Thanks, Grover. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.